Greetings. I am Dr. Rueben Brock, professor of psychology at California University of Pennsylvania and licensed professional counselor in private practice just outside of Pittsburgh, PA. Reverend Dr. William Curtis, Mount Airy Baptist Church, reached out to me and asked me if I would speak on a Trumped world. In other words, a world according to Donald Trump, or the world that our current president appears to be attempting to kind of create for us. And I'm going to do that, but first I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I always tell young people when I speak to them, as I often do, that it's important to, when you are hearing someone speak, make sure that you vet them. In other words, make sure that you check the credentials of the person who is speaking and attempting to give you advice to make sure that they have the qualifications requisite to give the advice on that which they speak. And so I want to kind of tell you who I am and what I bring to the table so that maybe you understand a little bit about my perspective and where I'm coming from. And so, one of the first things I think about when I think about a Trumped world is wealth. Donald Trump is always talking about wealth, his own wealth, and the wealth of America that he will usher in if he gets his way. And so, I'm a doctor. I'm a college professor. I'm married to a lovely lady who is in finance. We have done well for ourselves, and one might even say that we have achieved relative wealth. We are not rich by any means, but we are doing better than most. And so, you might imagine that I'm a fan of a Trumped world. And in fact, if Donald Trump has his way with many of the things that he is attempting to bring about in this country with respect to finance especially, it might do well for my family. But the snapshot view of my life is not the full picture of my life. And so, let me tell you a little bit of the full picture. In order to understand the story of me and where I come from and what brought me to this chair, we have to go back about 34 years. And so we go back 34 years to I'm 7 years old when I heard my first gunshot. I was in my mother's basement with my brother and sister watching television, and I heard a gunshot for the very first time. And of course, at the time, I didn't know what it was. I heard some screaming and lots of commotion. And it wasn't until some time later that I found out that gunshot I heard was, in fact, my father's gun. He had put a bullet in his own brain. And as you might imagine, that had an impact on my life. In fact, it had exactly the impact that you might imagine it would have on a young man's life to experience something like that. It didn't happen right away, but I eventually began to have some pretty significant mental and emotional distress. I had what I would have thought was a relatively normal childhood, but as I got a little older, I began to understand that I wasn't feeling like everybody else felt, and eventually I came to realize that I was experiencing some significant distress. At the height of it, now if we go back about 20 years, at the height of my mental and emotional distress and illness, I actually attempted to take my own life. Things had just gotten so bad for me mentally, emotionally, that I just felt like I couldn't go on. And so I attempted to take my own life. And if it wasn't for the fact that my mom came home and found me, I wouldn't be standing here or sitting here today. And so after that incident, I went on living, much to my chagrin at the time, actually. But eventually, I had an epiphany. And so eventually I learned or decided to use my experience as a catalyst, as motivation. And I decided to take my experience and use it as a means of helping others And so I, you know, as they say, picked myself up by my bootstraps, and with my mother's help, of course, got myself back into college, which I had dropped out of previously, and went and finished my degree at the University of Pittsburgh. And then I went on to get two more college degrees and went into private practice, became a college professor. And the rest, as they say, is history. And here I am now. I've been helping people for about 19 years. So really, right after things got to their worst, I began to get better, and things got a lot better for me. But I have in my life experienced some extreme low. You might ask yourself, okay, well, what does that story have to do with Donald Trump? And if you bear with me, I'm hoping that that will make some sense to you. So when I read the request from Dr. Curtis about a Trumped world, talking about a Trumped world, the first thing actually that came to my mind was an experience that happened right here in my office. Not long after Trump was elected, I got a phone call. Trump had just been anointed as our next president, and he hadn't taken office yet. And I got a phone call, and the phone call went something like this. The guy on the other, I answer the phone. Guy says, "I need a psychiatrist," and I say, "Okay." And the guy says, I need a psychiatrist because the one I'm going to right now, she's a towel head, and I don't want to see her anymore. And I'm thinking, okay, I don't know if I would agree with the language, or I didn't say that, but so I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, let me see if I can help this guy. And he says, yeah, my family doctor says I need a psychiatrist to prescribe my medicine. And so I used to have a psychiatrist, but she was one of them Asians, and I don't go in for all that voodoo. And so, again, I'm thinking to myself, wow, I don't know how this is going to go. So I just start to ask some questions, see if I can even help this guy. So I say, do you need medication? Do you need counseling? And he immediately stops me. I need an American. I need an American, because that last psychiatrist, I think she rides a camel to work. And I need an American. See, I'm going to tell you, I'm a bigot. I'm okay with being a bigot. Ever since 9/11, I'm a bigot, and I'm okay with that. And you're an American. I can tell you're an American. I like you. And, I'm thinking in my head, I don't know, if you're going to like me as much in person as you think you do on the phone. Little did he know I was using my white voice, And so, I try to help him. I'm trying to figure out what to do. And he says to me at one point, he says, listen, I voted for Donald Trump, and that's all I'm going to say about that. And so when I was reading, the request from Dr. Curtis, I thought about that conversation I had, with this guy on the phone. And I thought about the fact that he really believed that he could convey a whole set of beliefs he could encapsulate what he was trying to say to me by saying, listen, I voted for Donald Trump. And so I thought to myself, well, okay, well, what does that mean? What is the Donald Trump belief set? What is the Donald Trump mindset? What would a Donald Trump world look like? And when I think about that, the thing that I come up with is that a Trumped world would be a loveless world, right? A Donald Trump world, at least in my opinion, would be one that is void of love and regard for others. And hold that for a second. We're going to talk about what other means in a minute. But what I've noticed, so, I talk to some of my conservative friends. And so when I talk to conservatives, I'll sometimes ask, do you not have a problem with, the blatant racism, the sexism, the homophobia, xenophobia, all this, the hate that you see or hear coming from Donald Trump and many of his supporters? And what I will invariably hear when I ask that question is, listen, I don't mind that he says and does this. I like Donald Trump because he's going to do this. And they go on to talk about something that is more germane to their existence. So in other words, what I'm noticing is that they're saying, I'm not really worried about how these folks are being treated. I'm worried about how he's going to treat me, what he's going to do for me, or how I'm doing in general. I had a conversation with a friend of mine, more conservative friend of mine, but an actual friend. And I asked him, listen, okay, you know me, you seem like we're okay together. Do you not have a problem with some of the racist things that you see and hear coming out of this camp? And he said to me something that really kind of struck me, and it helped me to understand that mindset. What he said was, listen, some of the stuff that you're talking about, it doesn't really affect my life, and so I've really never given it any thought. And that really hit me. It allowed me to understand that sometimes it's not that folks are necessarily racist, or sexist or homophobic. Because some of them are, but oftentimes it's just a general lack of regard for others, right? And when I look at Donald Trump and some of the things that he's attempting to say and do as policy in America, it's just a general lack of regard for others, right? And so, how does that manifest itself? You see things like, the attitude that, well, I'm not really worried about the plight of the Muslims out there in the world because, they're Muslims and we're Christians and Christ is the only, the one and only true and living God. And so all the others, they're on their own. Or I'll hear people saying, well, I'm not really worried about the rights of the LGBT community because, according to the Bible, homosexuality is an abomination. And so, they're on their own. I'm not really worried about how they're doing and their rights, so to speak. And what's really interesting and ironic to me is that oftentimes I'll hear this stuff from Christians. It's not all Christians, but I will sometimes hear Christians really kind of espousing or and offering this belief set, this lack of love, this lack of regard for others. And I say that's ironic because at least my understanding of Christ was that he was the most loving. He was the most kind and generous and caring being to ever walk the face of the earth. And so I always ask the question, okay, well, if Christ were to come down today, what camp would he be in? Would he be in this, this Trump mentality, lack of concern, regard, lack of love, this kind of hate-filled rhetoric? Or would he be in a more loving and more caring and compassionate camp? I can't say that I'm a religious expert, and I would never offer that. But my understanding is that Christ was the embodiment of love, and so anytime someone is using the name of Christ as a means and method of hating others, to me, there's a disconnect. There's some sort of incongruence with that. And so, there's in the Trump world, there's this idea of us and then others. And so, I talk about other all the time, but first, maybe we ought to talk about who is us, right? And so, I don't think this is a Trump idea necessarily, maybe more of a Western idea in general. Western society has always been about this kind of in-group, out-group idea. And so in America particularly, there's always been historically, there's a group, the us in America, the in-group in America has always been wealthy, white, heterosexual men, right? If you think about the history of America and the beginning of America, really, the only folks who had rights really were in that group, the wealthy, white, heterosexual men, right? And so that is what I mean when I say the us, right? And understanding that I'm not in that group. The us in America is this group. And so then everyone else becomes other, right? And so if you look at America and really the plight of America throughout the last couple hundred years, it has really boiled down to this us and them idea. And so there's the wealthy, white, heterosexual men, and then anyone else. The further you get from that epicenter, the less regard the group has for your well-being. So you might see, maybe you're wealthy and you're white, but you're female. And so now the group just has a little bit less regard for the rights of your body and your autonomy over your body or your health care needs. Maybe you are male, maybe you are even wealthy, but you are black or brown. And now, again, the group just has a little bit less regard for your physical safety and the degree to which maybe you're being oppressed by different systems in America, criminal justice and finance and education, or what have you. And so or maybe you are in the LGBT community, and that's just too many steps away from the center. And now we just have a general lack of regard for your basic human rights. And so I believe if there's a conversation to be had, it's about that, this us versus them, and really how far we want to go down that path of us versus them. And there are lots of people who will watch this video and they will not identify themselves as Trump supporters or Trump followers, and yet they will espouse different pieces of that ideology, right? And so they'll say, well, yeah, I don't hate everybody, but this here group right here, this is why I have a problem with this group. And what my challenge to you is that Christ-like? Is that what we saw Christ do? There's a historical record of Christ's life, and is that the historical record? Was he divisive? Right? Did he shun folks? Did he, lack regard for people? Did he isolate? Did he separate? Or did he bring people together? Did he show love and compassion to everybody? Right? And I believe that's the conversation I hope that is going to be had in the future. I believe that's the conversation that Donald Trump and his followers would like to stop having. Right? That's the conversation that probably began a few years ago and ramped up and got some steam maybe under the previous administration. And I think there's maybe some attempt to silence that conversation and again break some of the bridges that were being built around the world. But I hope that the conversations being had in America, being had in churches, being had in living rooms and at the dinner table is how do we build bridges? How do we make connections with others? And what example do we want to set? What camp do we want to be in, really? This divisive, lack of regard, lack of love, or do we want to be in what I always call, the Christ-like camp? The folks who just attempt to live their life in the way that we know that Christ did. And so, I said a while back that my life somehow connects to this in some way, and I'll explain that. So we've got this in-group and other, right? And to some extent, everyone wants to identify with the in-group, feel like they're in the in-group. And oftentimes, which is interesting to me to see, folks who aren't actually qualified to be in this group will espouse the beliefs of the in-group in an attempt to sort of identify with and somehow be a part of the in-group. And so oftentimes you will see people who were at one point persecuted wanting to be a part of the in-group, and so being okay with the persecution of others. And so I think about my life. Here I am now doing relatively well, upper middle class, healthcare professional. Me and mine are doing okay. And I could say, go Trump, let's make life better for the wealthy. And all those folks who are doing bad, they're on their own, or whatever. But the thing for me is that I've been on the other side of that, right? If I am relatively wealthy now, I have to recognize that I was relatively poor before. If I go back 15 years, I was on welfare. Poor, struggling to feed my family. You go back enough years, and I was the college dropout. And so I can't really say I don't have regard or love for folks who are struggling, with poverty, because I was struggling with poverty, right? I can't say that I don't have concern for the mentally ill and their healthcare needs, because I was the mentally ill, and I know what my needs were at that time. And so, my perspective is unique in the sense that I've been on the other side. I've been on both sides of the fence at times, and so it it allows me to understand that, at least for me, there is no us and them. There is only us. There's only all of us, right? And I think that's the key, really, is for people to recognize that the us and them that we created that. We made that up. There is no real us and them, right? Those are divisions that were created by certain groups in order to maintain power, and any any attempt by any of us to fall into that group, or to use those beliefs and divide, is really just perpetuating the hate that was used against us at one point or another. You look at any group in history of America, they were persecuted by somebody else at some point. uh, and so my perspective is one of someone who could easily say, I'm on this side of the fence now and I'm doing okay and I'm not worried about them. But because I've been on both sides of the fence, I don't have the ability to see the us and the them. So, if I go back a ways, a couple years ago, my best friend and I were waxing philosophical about something, as we often do. And he said something that really struck me, that really hit me, and I use it all the time. I say this all the time. We were talking, trying to figure out the problems of the world, and he said to me, when in doubt, do the most loving thing you can think to do. And that, when I think about that idea, that it seems like that's it. That's the answer. When in doubt, love, right? And what I mean by that is aggressively, actively, do the most loving thing you can think to do in any situation. And so you really got to ask yourself, if you agree with me there, you got to ask yourself, what is the most loving thing to do? And certainly, I hope church folks agree that is, the work of the church and the body of Christ is to do loving things, right? And so I guess the conversation I hope that folks are having is how do we spread love, right? Unqualified, end of sentence, stop. How do we spread love to all, right? Not to some, not to folks that we like. How do we spread love, right? How do we do loving things out in the world so that we are an example and a beacon for others, so that others will begin to do the loving thing? Because if we all decided today that we're going to do the most loving thing that we can think to do, tomorrow and the next day and forevermore, eventually you run out of people who are hating each other, right? That would be the idea. And so my hope is that that's what we get to in this country. So the original question was, what would a Trumped world look like? And a Trumped world would look like, at least, my understanding of what he's attempting to do is, it would look like a country that is isolated from others, right? With a lack of regard for others. A country that is, generally speaking, lacking in regard for the folks at the bottom of society, so to speak, the folks who are not doing well, the folks who have not yet been able to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, and with a lack of regard for your neighbor, really, because if you watch a lot of what we're seeing, from folks, in the Trump campaign and with many Trump supporters, and really, in the Trump administration after he took the White House, there's a lot of kind of just hate-filled conversation. Whether they mean it to be hate-filled or not, I can't speak on, and I would like to give them the benefit of the doubt. But the idea here is, what I see is not loving, right? And so I believe that if we all followed the example that we're being given there, we would all eventually become these kind of self-absorbed, and self-centered, or our in-group centered people. And my hope is that we don't go down that path. And I believe the antidote to that is really to do exactly what we have seen in the example of Christ, is to be as loving as we can be. And there are plenty of folks doing that right now. I don't mean to say that there aren't. There are folks doing that work now, and being that example. And my hope is that the conversation that is being had, by those within the sound of my voice, and in churches all across America and in living rooms, is how do we counteract this hate, right? What is the antidote to hate? And we all know what the antidote to hate is. That, it almost goes without saying. And so, I appreciate the opportunity to be in this conversation. I appreciate it because, you know, as a psychologist, oftentimes my work is with individuals. And so I don't often have the opportunity to talk to a large group of people, uh, and even give an opinion, because in this room, generally speaking, my opinion is not what we're working on. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be in this conversation. And my hope is that when folks get together and watch these videos, as I understand you will, there will be a greater conversation. And my hope is that my voice becomes just a piece of this conversation. There's a psychologist out in Pittsburgh that said everybody ought to love each other. I don't know what the argument against that statement is, but I hope that conversation is being had out there. And so I want to thank Dr. Curtis for inviting me into the conversation, and I really do encourage those who may want to bring me into the conversation even further to reach out to me. It's not difficult to find me. My email address. Go to the California University of Pennsylvania website. You'd find me. But even in my absence, I hope that the conversation it really is focused on this idea of, well, what camp do we really want to be in? I believe that there is a movement in America happening toward more hate. I really believe that there's been a swell. Just the idea that someone was willing to call me and tell me, yeah, I'm a bigot, and I'm okay with that, and I'm assuming that you're okay with that. I believe that people have been emboldened by what our commander-in-chief says and does. And so what I hope is that there is an equally powerful force on the other side, right? Empowering love, right? Because if there's not an equal force, there's the danger that this powerful hatred could take hold in America and around the world. And so I hope that folks, pastors and church leaders, are ushering in this movement of love. And so, I encourage you all to just chew on that. And I thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Curtis, for allowing me to be a part of the conversation. And I wish you all well. Thanks for listening.